So in this video we're going to take a look at the lungs and then try to make sense of how we are able to ventilate the lungs, how we're able to draw air into the lungs and then squeeze air out of them. So let's get started. So the lungs have a really light kind of spongy consistency. The lung is primarily air-filled passageways, and we have this image here from the book that shows here we have the bronchus, the main bronchus coming in, and it branches and gets to smaller and smaller bronchi until eventually we reach the bronchioles. So the lungs are found in the thoracic cavity, surrounded by the bone and the muscle of the thoracic cage, and by the diaphragm that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. Right lung is slightly larger, divided into 3 lobes. The left lung is a little bit smaller and is divided only into 2 lobes. So each lung rests in its own pleural cavity, the sealed cavity that is lined by the serous membrane, the visceral and the parietal pleura. So here we can see the right lung, 2 lobes of it are visible here, and it's in this space that is separated by the visceral pleura, parietal pleura on the outside and the visceral pleura here at the inside. And we have just a little bit, I'm going to kind of color in here. This is the pleural cavity. There's almost no cavity there. The pleura are in very, very close contact, and so we just have a little bit of this thin, slippery pleural fluid there in the pleural cavity. And that thin layer of fluid helps to reduce friction as the lungs inflate and deflate, so that the lungs kind of slide rather than grabbing and catching as they inflate and deflate. But it also has another effect that we'll look at in just a minute, that pleural fluid and that thin space that helps with inflation and deflation of the lungs. So ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, is the processes of drawing air into the lungs, that's inspiration, and forcing air out of the lungs, that's expiration. And just like we saw with blood, air moves from areas where there is high pressure to areas with lower pressure. So the atmospheric pressure, if we measure it in millimeters mercury, is 760 millimeters mercury. If you listen to, say, the weather, they measure it in inches of mercury. So that 760 millimeters is something on the order of 29 and between 29 and 30 inches. So those numbers, that's how they relate to each other. If we're measuring it in the metric system, 760 millimeters mercury. If we're measuring it in inches, then it's 29.9 or so inches of mercury. And it doesn't take but a very small change in air pressure to allow air to either be forced into the lungs or to squeeze it out. All we have to do is drop the air pressure inside the lungs by about 2 millimeters mercury, from 760 down to about 758 millimeters mercury, and the air will come rushing into the lungs. So how is this all done? Well, first we've got to create a low pressure region there in the thoracic cavity, and we do this in 2 ways. So if the thoracic cavity is a sealed cage or sealed cavity, and when the diaphragm is at rest, it kind of domes up. It's longer because, of course, as it contracts, it's going to shorten. So if we have the diaphragm contracted, it flattens out. So here it is relaxed, kind of domed up into the thoracic cavity. When it contracts, contracts, that muscle shortens. That's a shorter distance. Now look at what's happened to the volume of the thoracic cavity. You can see that in this way, we have larger volume. The other thing that we can do that changes the volume of the thoracic cavity is the rib cage can lift. So here we are, here's the lifted rib cage that helps to also expand. So when you take a really deep breath, we expand the rib cage as well by contracting the external intercostal muscles. Alright, so how does that make low pressure? Anytime you have air or anything in a sealed cavity, but air is what we're talking about here. If you have air in a sealed cavity, if you make the volume of that cavity larger, you're going to decrease air pressure within the cavity. So that's called Boyle's law. And so and Boyle's law says that pressure and volume have an inverse relationship. If you enlarge, let's imagine if we had a balloon that was tied shut, and you could somehow like glue the balloon to your hands and then stretch your hands far apart, you would make the balloon larger. But since there was no, since the balloon was tied shut, there's no way to add air into that. And so the air pressure becomes lower when we stretch it out like that. If, on the other hand, we could squeeze that balloon in our hands without letting it bulge out anywhere, we could make it smaller, then we would pressurize the balloon even more. We'd be adding pressure to that balloon. So it's the same thing in our thoracic cavities. You make the thoracic cavity larger. Because no air can get in there, we reduce air pressure. You make the thoracic cavity smaller, again, because we're not letting any air escape, we're going to increase air pressure in the thoracic cavity. Okay, so that's the first trick. Now, the challenge is when we expand the thoracic cavity, we don't just want the thoracic, it's not the thoracic cavity that needs to have that lowered air pressure. We need to get it into the passageways of the lungs. And here's where the pleural fluid comes in. If you remember from when we were in lab, I gave you the two slides that you could put a little bit of water in between. A little bit of water in there between and water here, it would be the pleural fluid. That little bit of water helps to create a bond between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. So if this is a lung, here's the pleural cavity, and we now have a lot of surface area with pleural fluid sealing together the visceral and the parietal pleura. So as we pull down on the diaphragm, as we pull up on the rib cage, it pulls the visceral pleura with it. So it pulls the lungs open because they are sealed in there, because the visceral and the parietal pleura are kind of bound together or bonded together by the attraction that the water molecules in that pleural cavity have for each other. So rather than just enlarging, that's not what I meant to do. So rather than just enlarging and pulling open the thoracic cavity as the ribs and the diaphragm, as the external intercostals contract and the diaphragm contracts and the ribs are pulled upward and the diaphragm opens up the thoracic cavity, it pulls the lungs along with it. So the lungs are enlarged, stretched open. And now we've transferred that enlarged space not from just the pleural cavity having it to now all the spaces inside the lungs are pulled open. So now we've transferred that reduced, that should say not 740 but 758. There. We've reduced the air pressure by just about 2 millimeters mercury. Doesn't take much. And that causes air to rush in. This low pressure zone in the passageways of the lungs higher pressure outside in the air, outside the nose, forces air into the lungs. So compliance is a term that relates to how easily the lungs expand. The lungs have a lot of elastic tissue in there that kind of, that makes them very stretchable. But they also, that elastic tissue makes it hard to open the lungs a little bit too. So compliance is how easy or how hard it is to stretch the lungs open. But obstruction, anything that blocks the ability of air to flow into the lungs to allow them to stretch open, or lung diseases that reduce the stretchiness of the lung tissue, will decrease compliance, will make compliance less. Okay, so 2 tricks to open up the lungs or to ventilate the lungs. The first is we have to make low pressure. We do that by increasing the volume of the lungs. The second trick, or of the thoracic cavity, and the second trick is to transfer that low pressure area from the thoracic cavity to the passageways of the lungs, and we do that because the lungs stick to, the visceral pleura sticks to the parietal pleura, so that the lungs are pulled open as the thoracic cavity expands. That creates low pressure inside the lungs, drawing air in. So how do we get air back out of the lungs? Well, this is just a passive process. All we have to do is stop contracting the diaphragm and stop contracting the external intercostal muscles. And the elastic fibers that have been stretched out as the lungs were inflating, well, they snap back to their original length, and that recoil pulls the lungs back down to their resting volume. And as we increase air pressure then in the lungs, so we squeeze down on all the air that we've pulled into the lungs, all we have to do is, if air pressure outside the lungs is 760 millimeters mercury, all we have to do is increase that to 762 or so inside the lungs, and that is enough air pressure to force the air back from the lungs. As soon as we stop relaxing the diaphragm, the compression of all the abdominal organs that are inferior to the diaphragm, they've been squeezed. They help to kind of force the diaphragm back up into the domed shape that it had when it was relaxed. And again, the elastic fibers are going to pull it back upward too, and that gets everything back to the resting state. The alveoli inside the lungs will also shrink. Surface tension of the water will pull the alveoli closed a little bit more, and that even forces the air out of the alveoli back into the respiratory passageways. The increasing air pressure in the lungs forces all that air up out of the lungs and back into the atmosphere. Now, if you want to do a full exhalation, if you really want to squeeze that air out of the lungs, then the internal intercostal muscles can contract. That pulls the ribs downward, so that we get, that was me breathing out, all of the air, or as much air as possible, squeezed from the lungs. So a little bit then about lung volumes and lung capacities. So a respiratory cycle is an inspiration, inhale, followed by an exhale. So one inhale followed by one exhale is a single respiratory cycle. And if we want to think about respiratory rate, then all we have to do is turn that into the numbers of respiratory cycles every minute. So in adults, between 12 and 18 respiratory cycles a minute, while children, they always have faster, smaller bodies equal faster, equal, per volume, a higher need for lots of oxygen, so higher metabolic rates, and that means less, smaller bodies means less respiratory exchange surface area, and so smaller bodies have to have a higher respiratory rate. So children anywhere between 18 and 20 respiratory cycles per minute. So the amount of air that moves in and out with one respiratory cycle is referred to as the tidal volume. And we can have tidal volumes for any activity that we're doing. If we've been doing aerobic exercise, tidal volume will be larger. If we're just sitting there watching a boring movie on TV, tidal volume is going to be smaller. So at resting tidal volume, we move in and out of the lungs with one respiratory cycle, approximately 500 milliliters of air. About half of a liter is the resting tidal volume on average for people. But if we do resting tidal volume inhalation, so I brought in about 500 milliliters of air, there's still a lot of room in the lungs to accept more air. So if I do the maximum inhalation after that respiratory tidal volume is in the lungs, so I brought in as much air as I can, that's an additional almost 3 liters beyond the resting tidal volume. So the total maximum inhalation that we can do is somewhere around 3,500 milliliters. The 500 mils resting tidal volume plus the additional 3,000 mils of the inspiratory reserve, IRV. Sometimes it's abbreviated IRV. So inspiratory reserve is the maximum air that we can bring in after we've already breathed in the resting tidal volume. Now the expiratory reserve, that's the maximum air that we can breathe out after we've done resting tidal volume out. So take a moment and breathe with me. So one respiratory cycle of resting tidal volume in. There goes 500 mils in and then out. There goes 500 mils out. And now if you really breathe out, again, that was me breathing out as hard as you can, then you can breathe out, about another 1,100 mils of air. And we talk about that 1,100 mils of air that's breathed out after we've done our resting tidal volume breathe out as the expiratory reserve. So it's everything beyond the 500 mils that we just breathed out during the resting tidal volume expiration. And then last of all is the residual volume. So if you're, and yes, ERV, of course, would be the expiratory reserve volume. So residual volume then is the amount of air that is always in your lungs. We've got those cartilage rings that hold lung passageways open. The alveoli never fully collapse, hopefully, because they've got surfactant in there. So there's a volume of air that we can never breathe all the way out as long as we're alive. We'd have to kill us and run a steamroller across us. That's the only way we could get the residual volume out of our lungs. And that amount, that residual volume, is about 1,200 mils, so 1.2 liters. So about half of a big plastic bottle of soda. All right, so those are the lung volumes. There are also, then we can talk about lung capacities. So vital capacity, I think of vital meaning living. So this is the maximum amount that a person can breathe out after you've taken in the maximum amount of air that you can breathe in. So again, imagine you can do it. You're sitting there, you're doing a resting tidal volume, resting volume in, 500 mils, resting volume out, 500 mils, resting volume in, 500 mils, and now you bring in the maximum amount you can. So, if you're the average person, you've brought in 500 mils resting volume, tidal volume, and then you brought in another 3,000 mils of your inspiratory reserve. And now you breathe it all out. There goes the 3,000 mils. There goes the 500 mils tidal volume. And then you really clamp down with your internal intercostals. And you squeeze out everything that you can. And there goes the expiratory reserve. So if you, so when we talk about vital capacity, we're looking at the combined volume of the tidal volume, the inspiratory reserve, and the expiratory reserve. So that's approximately 4,600 mils of air. The inspiratory capacity is just what's the maximum amount I can breathe in. So that would be whatever the tidal volume is, plus that inspiratory reserve. So, of course, 3,500 mils is, on average, the average person's inspiratory capacity. The functional residual capacity, that is what's left in your lungs after you do a tidal volume exhalation. So, in 500 mils, out 500 mils, what's left in there? Well, what's left in there is the expiratory reserve and the residual volume. So that was 1,100 mils and 1,200 mils, totaling 2,300 mils. Oops, didn't mean the last zero. So right there, the functional residual capacity. And then last of all is the total lung capacity. So this is the amount of air that we can squeeze out of you after you took a maximal inhalation and we ran a steamroller across you to squeeze out everything that was in your lungs. So that's the vital capacity, which is, of course, tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, and expiratory reserve, plus that residual volume that we ran the steamroller over you to get the air out. So that would be everything added together for a total of 5,800 mils for the average person. Okay, so vital capacity, that's what a living person could breathe in and out. Total lung capacity, that's what you dead would breathe out after we rolled that steamroller over you. So that's kind of how I think of it. Vital, I think of vital meaning like living. Oh, I'm vital, I'm living. So vital capacity is what you can breathe in and out after, while you're alive. That total lung capacity is all the maximum amount of air that we can fit into the lungs, including that amount that we can never breathe out. Okay, two more, just a little bit more here, and then we will have finished up this video, so hang in with me. The anatomic dead space, that's that residual volume. So it's the portion of the 1,200 mils that's found in passages where no gas exchange can occur. So anatomic dead space is all the air that's held at a place where you can't get any oxygen from it. It's a small amount, about 150 mils. The alveolar dead space is the volume of any non-functional alveoli that you might have in your lungs. So COPD produces alveolar dead space, and emphysema will make some of the alveoli non-functional, so that will increase alveolar dead space. Pneumonia would create alveolar dead space. So in healthy lungs, there is no alveolar dead space, so everything is working well. But in lungs that have been damaged, there's alveolar dead space. So physiologic dead space, then, is the anatomic dead space plus any alveolar dead space that you might have. So again, in healthy lungs, because alveolar dead space is zero, then we should see anatomic dead space and physiologic dead space are equal. So if anatomic equals physiologic dead space, then we have healthy lungs, because there is no alveolar dead space. But folks who have alveolar dead space then will increase the amount increase the volume of air that's in contact with non-respiratory passageways. Then last of all, minute ventilation, that's the total volume of air that's moved through the respiratory passageways every minute. So that's whatever your tidal volume happens to be times the breathing rate. So at rest, if you have 500 mils, multiply that by 12 breaths per minute, you would have 6,000 mils or 6 liters of minute ventilation. The alveolar ventilation, that's how much new air reaches alveoli every minute. So that would be, you would calculate by taking your tidal volume, say 500 if you're at rest, minus that 150 mils of anatomic dead space, plus whatever alveolar dead space you might have. So in a healthy lung, it would only be 150. So we'd have 350 times 12 would be how you would calculate the alveolar ventilation, the amount of air that's getting to the alveoli every minute. Okay, so we also move air for non-respiratory reasons. If we cough, that's clearing the lower respiratory tract. A sneeze, that's clearing the upper respiratory tract. If we laugh, we're just talking about happiness or maybe frustration. Sometimes I laugh for other reasons besides just happiness. So laughter is a respiratory air movement, so is crying and hiccuping. Not really sure what's going on with a hiccup. We don't really understand why that happens, but it's a sudden inspiration along with glottal closing. So is you're bringing air in and your glottis is closing at the same time, and it creates that hiccup. Yawning, again, not really clear what the function is, although it may be, it seems to be involved with maintaining alertness. And then there's that whole social characteristic of yawning where it's contagious, which is a funny thing to have contagious yawns. And last of all, speech is, again, not respiratory, but it's about about communication, but it is certainly air movement. All right, so there, you've got it all. Call me if you have any questions, or not call, but send me an email if you have any questions.